Okay, hello everyone. So just to address a comment that was in the crowd earlier, the cheat sheets does not mean there's a test afterwards. It's just to help you. It's an aide-memoire. Okay. So my name's Charles Hall. I work for Astrium, as Bill mentioned. We are number 3 worldwide in manufacture of space satellites. We also do other space equipment. We're doing a European Mars rover right now, and we've built components which have found their way onto the International Space Station. We've used Confluence for about 2 years, and initially, of course, we're trying to get adoption of the tool, but more recently, kind of my role has shifted to really providing consultancy to our customers and helping them get the best out of the tool. And that's really what's helped us move in the direction of using user macros. So what's on the agenda for this presentation? We're going to cover off, first of all, exactly what is a user macro. We're going to look at 2 worked examples, and then at the end, we're going to give you a showcase of some extra macros we've developed as a kind of taster to see what you can do yourselves back at your base. So first off, what is a user macro? It's a way of providing added functionality to Confluence, a bit like plugins, in fact. It hides complexity for your page authors. The complexity resides in the user macro that you've developed. And it facilitates reuse, because you can use them on multiple pages. There are some restrictions, though. User macros are used by users, but they have to be registered by system administrators. Okay? If you want your users to give them the ability to create their own macros, it's probably best to do that on a test system, and when they're ready, your system admin can install that on your production environment. So where can user macros be used? In pages, of course, but also templates, and in fact in other macros. So you can have a user macro which calls a user macro. You can't, however, use user macros in your custom HTML. That's the part that you'll find in the administration screen, very often used for putting a banner across all your pages in Confluence. And what do user macros consist of? Well, here's where things get interesting. A mixture of any or all of the following. Some HTML, some JavaScript, a thing called velocity template language, and maybe references to Confluence objects. Okay. This slide is the key takeaway slide if any of you are sitting there as kind of project managers in the audience. The first curve we have on here talks you through the different, let's say, feature sets in Confluence. At the lower end of the scale, we've got standard wiki markup. So it's easy to use and offers a degree of functionality. Going on from that, if your Confluence installation is behind the firewall, you can activate the HTML macro, and that gives your authors more flexibility to use custom HTML and JavaScript. That increases the power of what they're able to do in a Confluence page. Next up comes user macros. Okay, that offers additional functionality on top because you can access Confluence objects, for instance. And beyond that, you've then got custom plugins, okay? And I'm sure you've all been to the vendor stands here over the last 2 days. Let's put a second curve on this graph, on this chart rather, and this is showing maybe effort of implementation, okay? So with standard wiki markup, it kind of goes hand in hand. You can do a certain amount for very little effort. But then with the HTML macro, a little bit extra effort is required. Anyone who's going to use it needs to know how to form valid HTML, and if they're going to do JavaScript in there as well, they need to understand JavaScript. When we come to user macros, however, it's my opinion that just a little bit extra effort is all that's needed on top of, let's say, HTML usage. And after that, what I think is the case is a very steep curve because the complexity involved in producing a third-party plugin climbs significantly. So what we're looking at here is a region where user macros can give you a bigger bang for your buck. So for a smaller investment time maybe than development of a custom plugin, you can get a lot of extra functionality. Okay, an example. This is one that is available on the shared user macro area on the Atlassian website. I've given you the URL in the cheat sheet as listing 1. And what this is a very simple kind of response time testing tool. So simply by using the macro you see there, this content is added to the page, and it provides a very simple test mechanism that any end user can use by clicking the Test Now button. The page refreshes and reports back to him how long the page refresh took. Okay? So on a blank page, you can get a baseline idea of performance of your Confluence installation. And in our situation, where we have a lot of distributed users across several sites, this is quite good in helping to diagnose potential problems which are inherent in the network. Okay. So some of you might be sitting there now thinking, I thought you said there was no coding involved in this. Well, yes, we did. What we're not going to get into, of course, is coding that would be needed for a custom plugin. So there's no development environment needed. We're not going to learn about Java development tools. What we are going to learn about are things to make life easy, one of which is jQuery, which is a JavaScript framework. And this is very fast becoming kind of the de facto standard for JavaScript frameworks. It's a very lightweight framework and helps you really do certain actions in the wiki page very, very easily. It's actually a framework already used by Confluence. So some of the cool effects you see in the Confluence UI, they've been achieved with jQuery. So on to our first worked example. And a lot of people have talked about enhancements to tables coming up in Confluence. Well, I will confess that we are still on version 2.8, but with the help of jQuery, we've been able to get enhancements in our tables. So here we are with some colored tables. Okay, let's look at how we've achieved this. So this is the user macro, the first version of user macro to achieve the row striping that you saw in the screenshot there. And I'll draw your attention first of all to this area, which all that is a comment header, so no coding. But what we're doing here is really a point of best practice. We're describing within the macro what it does and how it should be registered. Okay? Then down here, this is the actual script which is going to get executed, or rather pumped out to the wiki page when it's rendered in the browser. And if that looks a bit daunting, well, it shouldn't be, because these are the two operative lines of code, in fact. And here we are with a jQuery statement. And one of the basic principles of jQuery is that the operation you're doing is a selector operation. You're telling jQuery what elements on the page are of interest to you, okay? And here what we're interested in is any even-numbered table rows. What follows then is an operation we're going to perform on the collection of objects returned by the selector. So we're setting the background color to a certain color value there. The next line is pretty similar, except we're doing it on odd rows, okay? And here's the result. Now, as you can see there, the heading says test, test, then test some more, okay? What we can see has happened here, we've successfully colored our table rows, but the colors have bleeded out into the rest of the page. And that's because on this particular layout, the guys at Atlassian have used the table structure in HTML to do positioning, okay? So we need to overcome this little problem. And that's where another great tool can come to your rescue, a thing called Firebug. It's a plugin for Firefox. It can do a whole load of things to really save time for you. But what I want to draw your attention to is one very simple tool, which is this element here on the toolbar. By clicking that button, we go into a certain mode, and in the higher pane here, you actually see the Confluence page we're working on. And when we're in that mode, it means we can click on an element, and in the lower pane here, Firebug is working out what part of the HTML structure corresponds to what we clicked up here. And the interesting thing is that we can see that tables added into Confluence have a certain class, okay? This is great. It means that we can be more precise in how we construct our jQuery statement. So let's see that now. Here's the modified version. And before we were just selecting table rows, even ones and odd ones. Now we're saying what I'm interested in is tables which have that class. And then we'll pick the odd and even rows from there, okay? So that successfully stops the color bleeding out into other elements. It means we're just focusing on the tables within the main region of the wiki page. So that's all well and good, but if for some reason you want a more subtle color scheme than the one I presented earlier, I can't think why, then we need to introduce some user parameters, okay? So here we are, here's the color table macro, and we're passing in a color value there, then we have a pipe separator and a second color value. And you can see the effect here. We've now got perhaps a more appealing presentation. So let's see how we've been able to introduce user parameters into the macro. It's very simple. Confluence supports access to parameters expressed in the wiki markup. So here we are grabbing the first parameter, and we're putting it into a variable, which we'll use later on, called oddColor. Doing the same thing for the evenColor. And again, this is a point of best practice. We're actually now going to check that the user supplied these values. Okay? If he didn't, this line of velocity markup is setting a default color. Okay? So we're doing that for the oddColor, and we're doing it for the evenColor. And the lines beginning with the double pound sign are comments. So, you know, good practice again. We're commenting things as we go so we can understand what we've done later on. On to the second worked example. This is a typical Confluence page, black and white text essentially. We've used the code macro there. But we can do nicer things with the presentation. And here's one example. We've got a watermark. Okay? So all it is an image set as the background image of that region of the page. Okay? And in fact, this page is actually talking about how we've done this. So let's move on to the code. We've got three parameters, the first being the name of an attachment attached to that page. Okay? Then we have a repeating behavior and a minimum height. But the crucial one is this named attachment. So we take that parameter and stick it into this image variable. Then down in the line of jQuery code, what we're looking at here is using Confluence objects, or methods rather, to pull out the URL which reflects that attachment that was added. Okay? So we're getting the base URL of the Confluence installation, and then we're getting the kind of second portion of the URL, which is the URL for this image which was attached to the page. Okay? Setting the repeating behavior is quite an easy thing to do. We're just using the value that was passed in and setting the CSS property background repeat for the region of the page that we're interested in manipulating. And this will vary according to the layout that you're using. So the third element of this macro is setting a minimum height. So this is so that if the page we're working on only has a small amount of text, we still want to see all of the background watermark, the word that says draft. Otherwise, if we just saw a little bit, it would be a bit confusing for the users. So that's worked pretty well, but the feedback from our users was as follows. It's great, but if I want to do a draft watermark, I don't want to have to add a draft image to every page where I want to put in that draft watermark. So can you do this for me? And likewise, it'd be good if I could have the company logo as a watermark for my pages. Okay? So we took this on board, and we've developed two macros as follows: draft watermark, company watermark. And you'll notice these are very easy to use. They don't take any parameters anymore. So let's see how we've achieved that. The first step in achieving it is to go and modify our original generic watermark macro. And here we are checking the image parameter that was passed in. And we're saying if it starts with the string HTTP, well then that's a clue that we've received a full address to the image. Okay? Otherwise, let's just get the image in the same way we did before. And this is where things get interesting. Because now we're looking at the draft watermark macro. Okay? We've got the same comment header as before. And we've got this little bit in the description. This macro calls the watermark user macro. So here we are setting our full URL where we can expect to find the draft image. We're putting that into a variable. And then this special command here allows us to call the first user macro. So there we are calling watermark. We're passing in the URL, which we set here, and passing in the repeat behavior and the minimum height. And hey presto, that ensures we can always get access to that draft image. So I'm going to move on to the showcase now, showing you a few more tasters of what we've developed. First one, similar to the watermark macro, is a nice gradient background effect. This is very easy to achieve. We're basically using a nice image which is stretched across the background of the main viewing pane of the Confluence page. And of course you can have it in different colors, blue, red, whatever your imagination takes you. Second example actually relates to something that was mentioned earlier today concerning space themes. And there's a question in an earlier presentation, can I have multiple themes in one space? And the answer was given that was no, you can't. That's absolutely correct, but what we've got here is a kind of page theme, if you will. So what we've done, we've manipulated the Confluence page using jQuery. We've put in place various background images in different regions of the page. We've also played around with maybe padding and margins to make things kind of butt up nicely to each other. And we've wrapped all this up in a single user macro. So for a user to achieve this presentation, he just needs to stick the user macro notebook theme anywhere on his page, and that's the result. Okay? We're explaining this in more detail. It's not in your cheat sheet, but we're going more in depth with this with a blog post, which should be on the Atlassian website in the next 2 weeks or so. Another nice example, an RSS feed reader. jQuery has functions in there for making calls to web services, making calls to JSON resources, and one thing it can do is pull back data from RSS feeds. Okay, so what we're doing here, we've pre-configured this list with a certain number of RSS feeds. We've put this on the page. This is performed entirely on the client side. So the user can choose one of those feeds, and the page reacts accordingly, and the data from the RSS feed is inserted into the page. Okay? In the organization where I work, where IT security are particularly paranoid about server configuration and having our servers connected to the internet, pulling back RSS feeds from the Confluence server is a no-go. The fact that jQuery works on the client side means this is a much safer approach. Okay, another example then. It may be that a customer comes to you and he sees a plugin available for Confluence, and it maybe meets 75, 80, 90% of his needs, okay? But he's not quite happy with maybe one aspect. Maybe there's something wrong with the presentation. So this example is using the survey plugin, and what I've done is, you can't see this, but it's wrapped in the excerpt macro, okay? And the presentation on this screen is just fine, but if we then do an excerpt include on another page, and we're including it in a table here, well, it's then rather big, and there's really too much information there, and it's upset the whole presentation of the page. So by using jQuery, what we can do is eliminate some of the data we don't want to see. Okay, so I've got rid of some of the rows, and I've got rid of some of the columns. And Mike showed you earlier today about the ability to merge cells in the new version of Confluence. That's actually something you can do today just with jQuery. Okay. Now we can see, in fact, we can manipulate almost anything on the page. It doesn't matter if it's a custom plugin. It could also be a standard feature of Confluence. So here we are on a page we've been working with our health and safety team, and these are a number of official forms that they want to make available to the employees. And we've used the attachments plugin to generate this list dynamically. But what we can see is that there's a lot of information on here. Not all of it is really important to the audience we're addressing. So we can use jQuery to once again eliminate some of the columns on there, and therefore get a much cleaner presentation. So, in summary, we've seen that with user macros, we can add some real functionality to Confluence. We've seen also how users can control the behavior of those user macros to suit their needs. We've seen that we can access some elements, some objects available within Confluence, and perform some operations with those. And we can perform UI tweaks, both in custom plugins and in standard functionality available in Confluence. We can also reuse macros within other user macros. And finally, on page 1 of your cheat sheet, you'll see a list of references. There's a whole rich source of information in those, especially in the shared user macro library. I think there's in excess of 150 user macros which perform various functions. So definitely worthwhile following that up. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bill. I'm the author of the Confluence Reporting How-To. You can find that on our documentation site at confluence.atlassian.com. before I started at Atlassian, I was the IT manager at a medium-sized company. And I had a project to implement a reporting and business intelligence system. And I went out and I looked at various vendors and what my options were, and I saw that they were all quite heavyweight, usually pretty expensive, complicated, difficult to maintain over time, and they tended to require specialized expertise. Being the guy who was going to be responsible for that system, I didn't much like any of those options. And when I came to Atlassian, I was really blown away with what I saw, what they were doing with Confluence. They were using it as a lightweight dashboard that got information out of the various data sources around the business and in front of the people that needed it in a really effective and timely way. And what I want to do today is share with you some of the ways that we do that. But first, I'm going to start with some examples. This is one of our internal sales dashboards. It allows us to look at the sales performance of some of our products. And those charts down the bottom, the stacked bar charts, they're pretty looking, but the real cool thing about them is that they're actually real time. When this page is rendered, Confluence goes out to the sales database, retrieves the data, and then turns it into these charts right when the user loads the page. And so as that data changes, the chart will update as well. So it's very real time. Also note the drop down and the radio group over there. Those allow the user to drive the report, and they allow the user to select the parameters that the report uses. So by default, we were looking at Jira there, but if the user wants to look at another product, they just hit that drop down, they select the product they want, they hit run, and Confluence again will go to the sales database, get the data, and render it into those charts. So that's really neat, and what that does is it allows the user to say what data they need rather than you having to predefine the report up front, and that's really powerful. And that's built right into Confluence. Another example, this is a dashboard that monitors some of our control builds or our canary builds. Now, being a software company, our build infrastructure is pretty important to us, and we need to get data about the success and failure of these builds in front of the infrastructure teams that need to know it pretty much right away. And Confluence lets us do that by pulling data in actually from Bamboo, from another application that Atlassian makes, and getting it up on a Confluence page that we actually have on a big monitor in front of our infrastructure team. They can see right away when the builds fail. All those red marks there represent control build failures, which indicate that something's wrong with the build infrastructure. So that's a great real-time application of Confluence reporting. Further down on the same dashboard, those black line charts there show some timing data from some infrastructure timing scripts that we run. They time activities that developers undertake, like a subversion checkout of trunk or Maven action or browsing in fisheye, and they record that result in a database every hour. We're pulling that into this Confluence page alongside that blue bar chart, which is a chart of commit activity over time for Jira. And that data is coming out of a subversion repository. So you can see how on the one page we've got data coming from multiple sources all gathered together in one place, so the people that need to see it can look at it when they need it. Our customer service team is concerned with the volume of email that they're getting and how fast they're responding to it and servicing customer requests. And this is the dashboard that they use to monitor that. And what it shows is the volume of email coming in and out in a neat sort of 3-series line chart there. But the really neat thing, if you look up at the top, those tabs, the daily, weekly, monthly tabs, they allow the user to flip the period context to whatever they want to look at, whatever level of granularity they want to look at. Now those tabs are set up by the composition plugin. That comes from Customware. That's another freely available plugin. So they can flip between daily, weekly, and monthly and view it on whatever time scale they want to see. And that's pretty neat. All this comes from a few free Confluence plugins, and it's not hard to do. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do today. You connect Confluence to a database via JDBC. You all know what JDBC is, yeah? All databases that I know of support JDBC, including Microsoft SQL Server, Postgres, MySQL, MSQL, all of them. In fact, I don't know of a database that doesn't. The specifics of the setup are going to vary depending on the application server that you have Confluence running in and the database that you're using. We've got a few examples up in the Confluence documentation if you want to check those out. Anyone who's spent any time working with Confluence knows that one of its big strengths is the plugins that are available and that come from the ecosystem of plugin developers out there creating functionality and plugins for Confluence. And all of the plugins that I'm going to talk about today, all of them come from that community. They're all created by customers, and they're all available for free today on the Atlassian Plugin Exchange. So that's the first plugin that we're going to talk about is the SQL plugin, and that gives you the SQL macro. And this is a pretty simple macro. All it does is it takes a SQL query that you write in the source of a Confluence page, executes it against a JDBC data source, and then returns the results as a table in the wiki. And by default, it returns a table. This is pretty straightforward, but it's also pretty powerful. This is the elemental building block of everything that we're doing today. All of what we're doing is powered by the SQL macro. This is what the SQL macro looks like in code. You can see that what we've done is we've specified the name of the JDBC data source in the macro parameters there. And all this macro does is it takes the SQL statement that's in the body of the macro, executes it against that database, and returns the results as a table in the wiki. Now, this is a fictional sales database. You can tell that it's fictional because Atlassian doesn't actually make trucks yet. This is what such a table looks like. And that's pretty cool. It's all right, but to be honest with you, I think this table would look a lot better as a chart. It's got a lot of data there. It's a lot for the eye to take in. You turn a table into a chart with the obviously named chart macro. Now, all the chart macro does is it consumes a table or anything that produces a table, like the SQL macro, and turns it into a chart according to the parameters that you specify in the macro. Now, the chart version of that table looks like that. And you can see that that's a lot easier to interpret. That's the exact same data that was in that table. It's a lot easier to see the differences between the series and see the trends there as well. The source of a chart macro looks like that. You can see we've just bracketed the SQL macro with the chart macro and specified the type of chart and the parameters. Now, the chart macro has literally dozens of parameters, and I can't cover them all in any detail today, but if you check out the reporting how-to and the docs, it's all there. You can do all kinds of neat effects and transitions with a little bit of effort. It's got about probably a dozen different kinds of charts. In addition to line, bar, and the ones you've seen today, it does pies, scatter plots, stacked area, all these different kinds. Okay, now that we've got the data coming into Confluence into tables in real time, we've got those tables being turned into charts in real time as well. The next step is to make our reports interactive, like we saw with that drop-down at the beginning, accept user input. And we do that with the run macro. The run macro is our primary mechanism for getting input from the user into Confluence for use as criteria in a report, and that's what I'm going to show you how to use it that way. The run macro was written by a prominent contributor, Bob Swift, who I think is here with us today. Is Bob right there? Thank you, Bob. Thank you for the run macro. And with the run macro, all you do is you specify a variable in the macro parameters, and then what Confluence will do when it executes the page, when it gets input from a user, it will substitute what the user enters, which is what you see on the right there. When the user loads this page, they'll see that text field on the right. They enter motorcycle there. Confluence, the first thing it does before it does anything else is it will substitute what the user enters there wherever it sees the $category variable there, just like that. And the result looks like this. So that's really great. You've got a user-driven report where they're typing in criteria and it's driving the query, which is returning the data that they want to see. And that's great because they can then change their criteria. So if they want to see cars, they can punch in cars and they can see a chart for cars. But you might have cottoned on to the fact that it's not generally a good idea to have your users entering free-form text that then gets shunted into a SQL query and executed against one of your databases because they can make all kinds of errors there. But there's good news. The run macro, version 2.0, recently released, has all kinds of data input formats that you can choose from. It's got radio groups, multi-selects, checkboxes. You can use date fields, integer fields. You can validate input. You can set upper and lower bounds on input. You can enforce data types. You can also use a set of predefined variables like the current username or the current date for use as parameters in your query. And that's really good. Again, I can't cover them all, but if you check out the run macro docs for version 2.0, it's all up there. Now, the run macro, is there no end to its capabilities, can also accept input from a URL. So when a user invokes a page, they can pass parameters to the run macro when they load that page. What that means is that the user doesn't have to enter text into a text box. They don't need to select from a radio group or anything like that. They just click on a URL or a hyperlink that you give them, and the parameters get passed in the request to Confluence, which then accepts them into the run macro just like it would have if they had selected the option on the page, and generates the page accordingly. Let's blow up that URL. You can see you've got the base page URL at the top. There's the parameter, the key and the value in yellow there, and you can string along as many parameters as you need and make a big long URL with all your key value pairs in it, and pass as much data in as you want. And what is that good for? What you can do, as we've shown in this example, is create a top nav or any kind of nav that has hyperlinks in it that pass those parameters into the report. And so instead of typing in text in a form field, they just click on those hyperlinks up there, and the report changes in response to that. So they can click, 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 and get the report that they need. You can even take this one step further and make the creation of those hyperlinks dynamic using the SQL macro. And if they draw data from, say, your product category table, if somebody adds a product to the database, like when Astrium starts selling jetpacks, it will appear automatically in the list of hyperlinks that are available, and that'll be clickable. So that's a really cool zero-maintenance way for you to make a report. Let me go through some practical examples of the run macro, of the application of the run macro. Let's say you have an HRIS or a staff database. You can pull your list of staff from that database and use them as parameters in a report that reports on staff-related things, like a leave report or a sales target report. If you use other Atlassian products, like we showed in the initial example with Bamboo, we also run a lot of reports out of Jira. So you can pull data out of Jira as well and use that as input. Okay, scripting. I'm not going to cover scripting in any amount of detail today, but I am going to tell you what it is and what it's good for. The scripting plugin essentially embeds a script interpreter into Confluence. So what that means is that you can write your pages in a scripting language, either Groovy, Gantt, Jython, or Bean Shell, and Confluence will use the results of that script, the output of that script, as the source of the page. What that implies is that anything you can do in one of those scripts, or anything that's implemented in a library for one of those scripts, becomes possible for use as the source of a wiki page. And that's pretty awesome. The scripting plugin also, again, was written by Bob Swift. So thank you again, Bob. Here's script in action. This is a little Bean Shell script. It's just hello world in Bean Shell. I'm not going to go into any detail with the example, but you can see what happens is everything between the macro tags is in Bean Shell, so it's in the scripting language's native language. All Confluence does is it passes that to the script interpreter, gets the results back, and sticks them in a page. So this would just make a page that says hello Bean Shell world on it. So what scripting effectively does is it takes away any limits to what you can put on a page. I've seen scripts written by Andy Brook, I don't know if he's here this year, that go out and query LDAP directories over the network. So they use libraries, they use Java libraries to query LDAP, return that result into a Confluence page right there on the wiki. I've seen scripts that query SQL databases without using the SQL macro. So they get data, they connect to a database using database libraries, they return the results, they munge them up a little bit before presenting them on the page. I've seen scripts that do file access or network access, literally anything that's implemented in a library or that you can do with one of these languages, you can do in the scripting plugin. Okay. anytime you open up new ways to interact with your application, which is what we're doing today, you have to be aware of ways that that can be abused. And I've put together a few rules of thumb that you can use to help secure these plugins that I've talked about today. The first rule is to use the macro security plugin. Now, the macro security plugin was written by a prominent plugin contributor. Does anybody have a guess as to who that was? Yes, it was Bob. Thank you again for a third time, Bob. Macro security, all it does is it allows you to specify a list of users and groups that are allowed to create or edit pages that contain a given macro. For example, say you wanted to restrict the use of the SQL macro to a group of reporting users, people who were trusted with access to your data source. If you implemented the macro security plugin and restricted access to that group, anybody who wasn't in that group would find themselves unable to create or edit pages that contain the SQL macro. Now, they would still be able to load those pages and look at the reports and even use the run macro on those reports, but they would not be able to create or edit pages that contain them. So they wouldn't be able to abuse the script like that. The macro security plugin also allows you to restrict access to data sources. And that's important because by default, Confluence's first JDBC data source is its own database. And if you enable SQL, the SQL plugin, without enabling macro security, and a clever user is able to figure out the name of that data source and also can work their way around the Confluence data model, they would be able to access any content that's in the wiki without going through Confluence's page-level access controls. So that would be kind of bad. So you've got to implement the macro security plugin if you're going to implement any of these other plugins today. The second rule is about the data sources, and it concerns the JDBC data sources that you create to connect Confluence to another database. Now, the principle of least privileges says that users in your organization should have the least amount of privileges that they need in order to do their job. And in those JDBC connections, you need to specify credentials to connect as. So that user should have the minimum set of credentials required to do their job. In practice, what that means is that you use read-only users to connect to your JDBC data sources, because otherwise, your users can do all kinds of fun stuff with the SQL macro. Now, I can't think of a situation where you would want your users inserting or updating data or adding or removing tables through Confluence, but if you use your root user as the credentials for your JDBC connection, that's exactly what they'll be able to do. The third rule of thumb touches on performance as well as security. It's usually not good practice to run reports on production databases. So what people normally do is they extract and summarize that production data and stick it in another database that's dedicated for reporting. These are sometimes called data warehouses or summary databases. The mechanism that you use to do that is going to depend on your situation. You can use an ETL, extract, transform, load tool. You can use something that comes with your database like Microsoft SSIS or DTS. Or you could use shell scripts, which is what we use at Atlassian, to drive this exchange of data or import of data into a reporting database from around the organization. Now, the happy side effect of that is that the load that's put on your production databases happens at the time of summarization. It doesn't happen at the time of page load. So if you've got the SQL macro hitting your databases directly, then they're going to put load on those databases. But if you summarize that data first and put it into a summary database, then that load happens at the time of summarization, and you have a much greater degree of control over that load. You can stagger it at hourly or daily intervals. You can tune the queries so that they're optimized and generally reduce the load on the important databases and make sure the data gets into your summary database. Okay. Oh, that has security implications as well. So you wouldn't need to create JDBC data sources in Confluence for your production databases. You would only create one read-only data source to your summary database, and that's all that Confluence would have a look into. Okay, the Confluence Reporting How-To was written by John Rottenstein and I, and it's up on confluence.atlassian.com. It contains everything that I've talked about today in much greater detail. It's got links and references, so go and check it out. I'll give you the URL at the end of the presentation. These are the plugins that make Confluence an excellent tool for lightweight reporting and dashboarding. It's fast, it's simple, it's easy to maintain, and it's no trouble at all to implement. And if you already have Confluence, then it's completely free. All of these plugins are completely free. At Atlassian, we're pulling data from systems like Bamboo, and we're presenting it in the way that our different teams need to see it. We use the combo boxes, radio groups, and drop-downs to create interactive reports that let our users see the data the way that they need to see it without us having to define everything up front. And with no special packaging, no special reporting packages or extra software required. All these plugins are free, and they're available from the Atlassian Plugin Exchange right now, so you can go and give them a spin if you like, and I will be around for a little while afterwards if anyone has questions. This is the URL to the Confluence Reporting How-To. Thank you very much.